close on Judith's serene face as she turns a rusted crank under the scorching sun. In the background, laughter from men in luxury trucks. They called her the crazy old woman of the desert. Every day, Judith spent hours at an ancient stone well that was completely dry, while her rich neighbors mocked her, showing off their state-of-the-art irrigation systems. To them, Judith was just polishing the ruins of her own misery. The most powerful farmer in the region even told her, "Sell this land, Judith. That broken well is just a grave for your thirst." But what nobody knew was that Judith kept a secret her grandfather had told her decades ago, a secret about what really flowed beneath those silent stones. When the greatest drought in history turned neighboring farms into dust cemeteries and made rivers disappear, the whole world panicked. But while the empires of the arrogant crumbled, a strange sound began echoing from the bottom of that broken well. What Judith pulled up in that bucket wasn't just water. It was the bitterest lesson those who mocked her would ever have to swallow. Before I show you how Judith became the most powerful woman in that region and how the villain had to fall to his knees for a drop of mercy, subscribe now. Because today you'll discover that whoever takes care of the source never dies of thirst. Judith Cooper was 72 years old and had lived alone on her small farm for the past 15 years, ever since her husband passed. The property wasn't much, just 10 acres of land that everyone in the county considered worthless. The soil was rocky, the terrain uneven, and right in the center of it all stood what had become Judith's daily obsession, an ancient stone well that hadn't produced water in 40 years. The well was a relic from another era, built by Judith's grandfather in the 1920s. It was constructed from fitted stones, with a wooden beam across the top, supporting an iron crank and a rope that descended into darkness. The crank was rusted, the rope was frayed, and according to everyone who knew anything about wells, the thing had been dry since before Judith was born. But every morning, as the sun rose over the farmland of rural Oklahoma, Judith would walk out to that well and work. She'd lower a bucket down into the depths, pull up rocks and debris, clean the stones, oil the crank mechanism, and check the rope for wear. It was a ritual that consumed hours of her day, every single day, without fail. Her property was surrounded by massive industrial farms, thousands of acres of corn, wheat, and soybeans, managed by wealthy landowners who'd bought up all the small family farms in the area over the past 2 decades. These weren't the farmers of Judith's youth. These were agricultural corporations, tech-forward operations with equipment that cost more than most people's houses, and they had water, lots of it, deep artesian wells with electric pumps, automated irrigation systems controlled by computers, pivot sprinklers that covered entire fields. From her small property, Judith could see 3 massive farms, and their owners made sure everyone knew how successful they were. The biggest and loudest of them was Dale Thornton, a man in his 50s who'd inherited money from his father and had used it to buy up half the county. Dale's farm was a showcase of agricultural technology, pristine white buildings, shiny equipment, and wells that pumped thousands of gallons per hour. Dale loved to drive his black luxury truck down the county roads, windows down, making sure everyone saw his success. And he especially loved to stop by Judith's property to remind her how pathetic her situation was. Every few weeks, Dale would pull up to Judith's property line, lean out his window, and shout comments. "Still playing with that pile of rocks, Judith? You know that well's been dry since your grandfather's time, right?" Judith would wave politely and continue her work. "You're wasting what little time you got left, old woman. That well's not going to suddenly start flowing because you're polishing stones." Judith would smile slightly and say nothing. It infuriated Dale that she wouldn't engage, wouldn't defend herself, wouldn't show any sign that his words affected her. He wanted her land, not because it was valuable, but because her small property interrupted the clean borders of his massive farm, a ragged little homestead stuck right in the middle of his empire. It bothered him aesthetically. He'd made her offers before, lowball offers that insulted the property's actual value, but he figured an old widow living alone would eventually get desperate enough to accept. Judith had refused every time, politely but firmly. "This land's been in my family for 100 years, she'd say, It'll stay in my family." "What family?" Dale would laugh. "You got no kids, no relatives who visit? You're alone out here, Judith. Who are you saving it for?" Judith never answered that question. She'd just turn back to her well and continue working. What Dale and the other farmers didn't know, what nobody knew except Judith, was that her grandfather had left her more than just land. He'd left her his journals, dozens of leather-bound notebooks, filled with observations, measurements, and knowledge gained from 60 years of farming this exact land. And in those journals, her grandfather had written extensively about the well. He'd explained how he'd chosen the location carefully, studying the land for years before beginning construction. He'd written about something he called the deep vein, a layer of porous rock far below the surface that connected to an underground aquifer fed by distant mountains. He'd described how most wells in the area were shallow, tapping into surface water tables that fluctuated with rainfall. But his well was different. It went deep, down through clay and bedrock, reaching for water that came from ancient sources. "The deep vein doesn't care about rain," he'd written. "It flows from places where snow melts in mountains 100 miles away. It takes years for that water to reach here, moving through cracks in the stone. Most men don't have the patience to wait for it, but the one who does will never go thirsty, even when the sky turns to brass." Judith had read those words 1,000 times. She'd inherited the journals when her grandfather died, and she'd studied them like scripture. She understood what he was telling her. The well wasn't dry. It was just deep, deeper than anyone else had ever drilled, and for 40 years it had been slowly filling, water trickling through microscopic channels in the rock, accumulating in the shaft, rising inch by inch toward the surface. Her daily work wasn't meaningless. She was preparing the well for what her grandfather had promised would eventually come, water from the deep vein, pure and cold and inexhaustible. She cleaned out the debris that had accumulated over decades. She maintained the mechanism so it would work when needed. She kept faith with her grandfather's knowledge, even when everyone else thought she was crazy. The other farmers didn't understand. They saw an old woman wasting her time on a broken well. They laughed at her stubbornness, her refusal to accept reality, her pathetic devotion to a hole in the ground that would never produce anything. Dale Thornton was the worst of them. He'd tell stories about Judith at the grain elevator, at the diner in town, anywhere farmers gathered. "You seen the crazy Cooper woman lately? Still out there cranking that dead well like it's going to suddenly start raining underground. I swear she's lost her mind." People would laugh. Some felt pity. But nobody took her seriously. Judith was just a harmless old eccentric, clinging to the past, unable to accept that modern technology had made her grandfather's old ways obsolete. Let her play with her rocks. Let her waste her time. It didn't matter. The new farmers had real wells, real water, real success. Then the sky turned to brass, just like her grandfather had written about. And everything changed. It started gradually in late spring. The usual April rains didn't come. May stayed dry. By June, people were starting to worry. By July, the worry had turned to concern. By August, it was panic. The drought hit Oklahoma like nothing anyone had seen in living memory. Week after week, without a single drop of rain. The sky stayed cloudlessly blue, mocking everyone who looked up, hoping for relief. Temperatures soared into the hundreds and stayed there. The earth cracked. Rivers that had flowed for centuries dwindled to mud, then dried up entirely. The large farmers tried not to worry at first. They had technology, they had wells. They'd pump enough water to keep their crops alive until the rain returned, but their wells were shallow. They tapped into aquifers that were fed by rainfall and runoff, and without rain those aquifers began to drop. At first it was barely noticeable. The pumps ran a little longer to get the same amount of water. Then they ran a lot longer. Then they started coughing air. Dale Thornton's showcase farm was among the first to really feel it. His wells, which had pumped thousands of gallons per hour, slowed to hundreds, then to gallons per minute. His irrigation systems, designed to cover vast acreages, sputtered and failed. His corn, which had been lush and green in June, began to yellow in July. By August, entire fields were brown and dying. He wasn't alone. Across the county, across the state, the big industrial farms that had seemed so invincible were failing. Their shallow wells, their expensive technology, their modern systems, none of it mattered when there was no water to pump. The drought was merciless. 3 months became 4. 4 became 5. The government declared a disaster. Water rationing was imposed. Some towns ran completely dry, their residents forced to truck in water from hundreds of miles away. It was a catastrophe. And through it all, Judith continued her morning ritual at the well. Every day she'd go out. She'd work the crank, she'd lower the bucket into the darkness. People driving by didn't even laugh anymore. It was too sad. The old woman, still devoted to her delusion, even as the world burned. Dale Thornton stopped his truck by Judith's property one scorching afternoon in late August. His farm was dying. He was hemorrhaging money. His pristine white buildings were coated in dust. His expensive equipment sat idle, because there was no point irrigating fields with air. He looked at Judith working her well and felt a surge of rage. "You still at it?" he shouted. "The whole state's dying of thirst, and you're still playing with that broken toy?" Judith looked up, wiped sweat from her forehead, and smiled slightly. "Good afternoon, Dale. How are your fields doing?" It was a polite question, but it landed like an insult. Dale's fields were dead. "My fields are fine," he lied. "Wells are holding up just fine." "That's good to hear," Judith said. "I was worried." "You were worried? About me?" Dale laughed harshly. "Judith, I got 6 wells. 6. Deep wells with electric pumps. You got one pile of stones that hasn't had water since your grandfather died. Who should be worried here?" "I suppose we'll see," Judith said calmly and went back to work. Dale drove off in a cloud of dust, furious at her refusal to acknowledge reality. 2 weeks later, his last working well coughed its final gallon and went dry. Dale Thornton's empire was dying of thirst. And he wasn't the only one. All the big farmers, all the wealthy landowners, all the people who'd laughed at Judith, they were all watching their livelihoods turn to dust. Then, on a morning in early September that started like every other morning for the past 40 years, something extraordinary happened. Judith went out to her well at dawn as she always did. The sun was just cresting the horizon, painting the brown landscape in shades of gold that would have been beautiful if everything wasn't dying. The temperature was already climbing toward what would be another 100-degree day. Judith's small farm was an island of stubborn routine in an ocean of catastrophe. She approached the well, running her hand along the sun-warmed stones as she did every morning, feeling the familiar rough texture under her calloused fingers. The stones were fitted together without mortar, held by their own weight and the skill of her grandfather's craftsmanship. Each stone had been chosen carefully, placed precisely. This wasn't just a well, it was a monument to patience and faith. Judith wrapped her hands around the wooden handles of the crank. The wood was worn smooth by decades of use. First her grandfather's hands, then her father's briefly, then her own for the past 50 years. The metal of the crank mechanism was orange with rust, but Judith kept it oiled, kept it functional. It groaned slightly as she began to turn it, lowering the wooden bucket on its frayed rope down into the darkness. She'd made this descent thousands of times. She knew every sound, every sensation, the rope sliding through her hands, the bucket scraping against stone as it descended, the echo changing as the bucket went deeper, the sound becoming more hollow, more distant. Usually, after about 30 seconds of descent, she'd hear the bucket hit bottom, a dull thunk of wood striking stone, sometimes followed by the rattle of pebbles. But this morning, the sound was different. This morning, after 28 seconds of descent, she counted automatically. Her internal clock calibrated by years of repetition, she heard something she hadn't heard in her entire life. Splash. Not a thunk, not wood hitting stone, but a splash. The unmistakable sound of something heavy hitting water. The liquid sound of displacement, of waves spreading outward in a confined space. Judith's hands froze on the crank. Her heart stopped, then started again, pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Water. After 40 years of faith, after a lifetime of mockery, after months of the entire world telling her she was wasting her time on a broken dream. Water. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the crank handles. She stood there for a long moment, afraid that if she pulled up the bucket it would be empty, that she'd imagined the sound, that this was just her mind finally breaking under the strain of grief and drought and loneliness. But she hadn't imagined it. She knew that splash. She'd heard it in her dreams for decades. It was real. With trembling hands, Judith began to turn the crank in reverse, pulling up. The mechanism groaned, the rope creaked, and immediately Judith felt the difference. Weight, real substantial weight. The bucket wasn't empty. Something was in it, something heavy. The crank was harder to turn than it had been in years. Judith's 72-year-old arms strained with the effort. Her back protested. Her hands, already calloused and worn, gripped the wooden handles so tightly her knuckles turned white. She pulled, hand over hand, turn by turn, the crank rotating with agonizing slowness. The rope appeared at the top of the well, wet. The rope was wet, dark with moisture, water dripping from its fibers back down into the shaft. Judith's vision blurred with tears, but she kept turning, kept pulling, her breath coming in gasps that were half sobs. 30 seconds of pulling, 40, 50, and then the bucket appeared. Rising from the darkness of the well shaft, emerging into the morning sunlight, Judith saw it. Water. The wooden bucket was full of water, so full that it sloshed over the sides as it swung slightly on the rope. Clear water that caught the sunlight and threw it back in diamonds. Water that splashed onto the stones of the well and darkened them. Water that had been in the earth, in the deep vein her grandfather had promised, traveling for years through cracks in ancient rock to reach this place, this moment. Judith guided the bucket onto the stone rim of the well with shaking hands. She stared at it, afraid to touch it, afraid it would vanish if she did. The water was perfectly clear. She could see the grain of the wooden bucket through it, and when she finally reached out, trembling, and dipped her fingers into it, the cold shocked her. It was ice cold. Colder than any well water she'd ever felt. Cold like water that had been deep in the earth, in stone that never felt the sun, fed by sources that began as snow on distant mountains and took years, decades maybe, to filter down through the rock to reach this aquifer. Judith brought her wet fingers to her lips. The water was pure, completely, perfectly pure. No mineral taste. No hint of the sulfur or iron that plagued so many wells in the area. Just pure water, clean and cold, and exactly as her grandfather had promised it would be. "Oh, grandfather," Judith whispered, and then she couldn't speak anymore because she was crying too hard. She sat down on the stone edge of the well, sat down hard, her legs giving out, and she cried. Deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. She cried for her grandfather, who'd known this would happen but died before seeing it. She cried for the 40 years of faith, of daily work that everyone said was pointless. She cried for her husband, gone 15 years, who'd supported her even when he didn't fully understand. She cried for herself, for the loneliness of being right when everyone else was wrong, for the burden of keeping faith when the whole world called you crazy. But mostly she cried from relief. Pure, overwhelming relief. She wasn't crazy, she wasn't a fool. Her grandfather hadn't been wrong. The well had never been broken. It had just been waiting, waiting for its time, waiting for the moment when the deep vein would finally fill the shaft, when the water would reach high enough to touch the bucket, when 40 years of patient work would be vindicated in a single splash. Judith cried until she had no tears left. Then she stood up, wiped her face with her work-worn hands, and looked at the bucket of water sitting on the rim of her well. It was real. It was here, and she had work to do. She dumped the bucket into one of the large barrels she kept near the well. Then she lowered it again. Splash. Water. She pulled it up. Full again. The water level in the well wasn't dropping. It was being replenished as fast as she could pull it up, flowing from the deep vein, from the aquifer that didn't care about the drought, from sources far beyond the reach of the crisis that was destroying everyone else. Judith pulled up another bucket, and another, and another. She worked for 3 hours straight, pulling up water, filling every container she owned, barrels and buckets and pots and jars and anything that could hold liquid. Her arms ached. Her back screamed. She didn't care. She pulled up water until she'd filled everything, and the well just kept producing, generous and inexhaustible, exactly as her grandfather had promised. By mid-morning, Judith had set up her irrigation system. Nothing fancy, just a series of hand-dug trenches and clay pipes leading from the barrels to her garden. She opened the valve on the first barrel and watched the water flow out, following the trenches, soaking into the parched earth of her garden. The dry ground drank it greedily. Within minutes the soil had turned from dust to mud. Within an hour, her withered cornstalks were standing straighter, their leaves brightening from brown to green. Her tomato plants, which had been on the edge of death, perked up. Her squash vines, which she'd thought were gone, showed new growth. Water brought the land back to life. And Judith stood in the middle of her garden, watching the miracle unfold, watching the vindication of 40 years of faith bloom in green and growing things. And she laughed, pure, joyful laughter that echoed across her small property and out into the dying landscape beyond. The well that everyone said was broken had finally shown what it really was. Not broken, just patient, just waiting, just faithful to the promise made by a man who'd understood things that modern farmers had forgotten. And Judith, who'd kept that faith when no one else would, was reaping the reward. That night, as she sat on her porch watching the sunset over fields that were green for the first time in months, Judith pulled out her grandfather's journal and read his words again. The deep vein doesn't care about rain. It flows from places where snow melts in mountains 100 miles away. Most men don't have the patience to wait for it, but the one who does will never go thirsty, even when the sky turns to brass. You were right, grandfather, Judith said softly, about everything. Thank you for teaching me patience. Thank you for teaching me faith. Thank you for building something that would outlast the mockers and reward the faithful. The next morning, Dale Thornton drove past her property and nearly crashed his truck. Judith's garden, which had been as brown and dead as everyone else's, was impossibly green. And standing in the middle of it, pulling up another bucket of clear, cold water from her broken well, was Judith Cooper, smiling peacefully, vindicated at last. Cornstalks that had been withering were standing tall. Tomato plants were heavy with fruit. Squash vines were sprawling across rich, damp soil, and in the center of it all, Judith was working her well, pulling up bucket after bucket of water, smiling peacefully as she poured life back into her land. Dale stopped his truck and got out, staring in disbelief. "Where are you getting water?" Judith turned to face him, and for the first time in all the years Dale had known her, she wasn't just polite, she was powerful. "From my broken well," she said simply, "the one that was just a grave for my thirst." Word spread through the county faster than fire. Judith Cooper's well was flowing. In the middle of the worst drought in history, when every river was dry and every well had failed, the crazy old woman's ancient stone well was producing water. People came to see for themselves. They'd drive slowly past her property, staring at the impossible green of her garden, at the water she was pulling up bucket by bucket, at the proof that sometimes the old ways, the patient ways, the ways everyone had mocked, were the ways that endured. At first, the other farmers refused to believe it. There had to be a trick. Maybe she was trucking in water and pretending to pump it. Maybe it was a temporary pocket that would run dry in days. Maybe it was anything except what it appeared to be, a genuine miracle of water in the desert of drought. But the water kept flowing. Day after day, week after week, Judith's well produced, and her small farm, which everyone had dismissed as worthless, became an oasis visible from the county road. The contrast was stark and undeniable. On one side of the fence, massive industrial farms, thousands of acres of dead crops, expensive equipment sitting idle, wells that pumped nothing but air and broken dreams. On the other side, Judith's small 10 acres, green and thriving, vegetables growing, flowers blooming, all fed by water from a well everyone had said was broken. By mid-September, Judith's garden had become a legend. News crews came out to film it. The county newspaper ran a story. Agricultural officials came to test her water and were astonished by its purity and apparently limitless supply. They brought in geologists who studied the well and realized what Judith had known from her grandfather's journals. The well tapped into a deep aquifer, fed by underground sources far beyond the reach of the drought. It was a rare geological formation, and Judith's grandfather had somehow known about it a century ago when he'd chosen the location for his well. The officials were amazed. Judith was unsurprised. She'd always known, she just hadn't known when. The transformation of Judith's status in the community happened almost overnight. The crazy old woman who'd been mocked for years was suddenly Judith Cooper, the woman with the only reliable water source in the county. Her phone, which rarely rang, started ringing constantly. Small farmers, people who'd been kind to her over the years, people who'd never mocked her obsession with the well. They called asking for help. Their animals were dying. Their gardens were gone. Could they possibly buy some water? Judith didn't hesitate. "Come by in the morning," she'd say. "Bring whatever containers you have. Take what you need." She didn't charge them. These were her neighbors, people who'd treated her with respect. She gave freely as her grandfather would have wanted. But the big farmers, the wealthy landowners, the people who'd laughed at her, they were more complicated. Dale Thornton waited longer than most to approach her. His pride wouldn't let him admit he needed help from the woman he'd mocked for years. But by late September, his situation was desperate. His fields were total losses, his cattle were dying, his wells were completely dry. He'd spent tens of thousands of dollars trying to truck in water, but it was never enough and he was running out of money. One evening, as the sun was setting and casting long shadows across the dusty landscape, Dale Thornton's black luxury truck pulled up to Judith's property. But this time, he didn't lean out the window shouting insults. This time he got out, walked slowly to where Judith was working at her well, and stood there silently, hat in his hands. Judith pulled up a bucket of water, poured it into a barrel and turned to face him. "Evening, Dale." "Evening, Judith." He looked at the ground. "I need to talk to you. I figured you might." Judith's voice was kind but firm. "I need water." Dale's voice cracked slightly. "My cattle are dying. I've lost everything in the fields. I've got 80 head of cattle and they're dropping every day. I need water." Judith studied him for a long moment. "You remember what you said to me about this well?" Dale nodded, shame burning his face. "I said it was a grave for your thirst. I said you were wasting your time. I said a lot of things. I was wrong. I'm sorry." "Are you sorry you were wrong, or sorry you need help?" Dale looked up, meeting her eyes. "Both. I was cruel to you. I treated you like you were nothing, and now I'm standing here begging you for help. I've got no right to ask, but I'm asking anyway. Please." "I'll pay whatever you want." Judith pulled up another bucket of water. The sound of it splashing was the only sound for a long moment. Then she poured it into a cup, walked over to Dale and handed it to him. "Here." Dale took the cup with shaking hands and drank. The water was cold and pure. He'd never tasted anything so good in his life. "Thank you," he whispered. "You can come by tomorrow morning," Judith said. "Bring tanks. I'll give you enough for your cattle. 1 gallon per head per day. That'll keep them alive." "How much?" "No charge. Not for the first week. After that we'll talk." Dale looked at her in disbelief. "Why? After everything I said to you, why would you help me?" Judith smiled slightly. "Because my grandfather taught me something, Dale. He taught me that water doesn't care if you're rich or poor, kind or cruel. It just flows where it's meant to flow, and I'm meant to share it, even with people who mocked me." She turned back to her well. "But I'm not giving you everything. I'm giving you enough to keep your cattle alive. Your crops are gone. Your expensive equipment won't help you now. You're going to learn what it means to be humble, to accept help from someone you thought was beneath you." Dale nodded slowly. "I understand. I hope you do." Judith pulled up another bucket. "Because if you come here tomorrow and you're still the same arrogant man you were before, I'll turn you away. But if you come here ready to learn, ready to change, then we'll talk about helping you rebuild. Not your empire, just enough to survive. That's the lesson, Dale. Sometimes survival is enough." Dale drove away that night, a different man than he'd been. His black luxury truck felt ridiculous now, a symbol of pride that had nearly destroyed him. The next morning, he showed up at dawn with water tanks, and he waited his turn behind the small farmers Judith was already helping. And when it was his turn, he said thank you, truly meant it. And Judith, who'd been mocked and dismissed and told she was wasting her life, gave him water from the well that was never broken, just patient. And the whole county learned that sometimes the ones everyone dismisses are the ones who save everyone in the end. Within 2 months, Judith's small farm had become the center of a quiet revolution. She couldn't provide enough water for everyone. The well was generous but not infinite. But what she could do was help the small farmers and families who'd treated her with respect over the years. She developed a system. Every morning, she'd spend hours pulling up water, filling the large tanks that neighbors brought. She had a sign-up sheet. Everyone got 1 allotment per week, enough for basic needs, for animals, for small kitchen gardens. It wasn't enough to run large farms, but it was enough to survive, and that made all the difference. The small farmers who'd been struggling, who'd been on the verge of losing everything, found themselves able to hold on. They couldn't grow cash crops, but they could keep their animals alive, grow food for their families, maintain their homes. They survived. The large industrial farms didn't. Dale Thornton's empire collapsed completely. Without water for his thousands of acres, without the ability to irrigate, his crops failed totally. The banks foreclosed on his loans. His expensive equipment was repossessed. Within 3 months of the well flowing, Dale was forced to sell most of his land at auction for pennies on the dollar. He kept a small portion, about 50 acres, and on that small farm, with water rationed from Judith's well, he started over. No more showcase operation. No more pristine buildings and shiny trucks. Just a man, some land, a few cattle, and the humility to accept help from the woman he'd once mocked. The other large farmers faced similar fates. The drought exposed the fragility of their model. They'd built empires on the assumption that water would always be available, that technology could overcome any obstacle, that they'd never face real scarcity. They were wrong, and when the water ran out, their empires collapsed. But Judith and the small farmers she helped, they endured. Not comfortably, not with luxury, but they survived. And in the process, they learned something the big farmers had forgotten, that real wealth isn't measured in acres or technology, but in resilience, community, and the wisdom to prepare for hard times. By early November, the drought finally broke. Clouds rolled in from the west, heavy with rain, and it poured for 3 days straight. The rivers began to flow again. The aquifers began to recharge. The crisis, while not over, was no longer desperate, but the damage was done. The agricultural landscape of the county had been permanently changed. The big industrial farms were gone, their land broken up and sold to smaller operators. The era of massive corporate agriculture in that part of Oklahoma was over. In its place, something older returned. Small farms, family operations, people who knew their land, who didn't overextend, who understood that there were limits to what you could take from the earth. And at the center of it all, Judith Cooper became something unexpected, a leader. She called a meeting at the community center in late November. Most of the small farmers who'd survived came. So did Dale Thornton and a few other former big operators who'd been humbled by the drought. Judith stood in front of them, 72 years old, wearing a simple dress and practical boots, looking exactly like what she was. A farmer who'd worked hard all her life. "We've been through something terrible," she said. "We've lost crops, lost animals, lost friends who couldn't hold on. We've seen what happens when the sky turns to brass and the wells run dry. But we survived. We're here, and now we need to decide what we do next." She looked around the room. "I propose we form a cooperative. We pool our water resources, my well and any others that still produce. We share equipment. We help each other with labor during planting and harvest. We stop competing and start cooperating, because the next drought will come eventually, and when it does, we need to be ready." There was silence for a moment. Then Dale Thornton stood up. "I support this," he said. "I learned something these past months. I learned that I was building on sand. I thought having the most land and the best equipment made me successful, but when the water ran out, none of that mattered. The only reason my cattle survived was because Judith was generous enough to help me after I'd been nothing but cruel to her. I won't forget that, and I won't make the same mistakes again. Others nodded and spoke their support. By the end of the meeting, they'd formed the Cooper Wells Cooperative, named after Judith's grandfather, the man who'd had the wisdom to dig deep enough to reach water that would endure. The cooperative changed everything. Instead of each farm struggling alone, they worked together. They shared the burden of the drought's aftermath. They helped each other rebuild, and Judith, who'd been dismissed as crazy for years, became the quiet center of it all, not because she sought power, but because everyone recognized that she'd been right when they'd all been wrong. She'd had the patience to wait, the faith to keep working when it seemed pointless, the wisdom to trust her grandfather's knowledge over everyone else's mockery, and when the crisis came, she'd been the only one prepared. The cooperative thrived, not with the flashy success of the old industrial farms, but with the steady, sustainable success of people who'd learned to work with the land instead of trying to dominate it. Judith's well continued to flow. Even after the drought ended and other wells recharged, hers remained special, colder, purer, never failing even in dry spells. It became a symbol of what patience and wisdom could accomplish. And Judith herself, she continued her morning ritual at the well. Every day she'd go out, work the crank, pull up water, and tend to her small farm. But now, instead of mockery, she received respect. Instead of insults, she received gratitude. Instead of being called crazy, she was called wise. One morning in early December, a young couple drove up to her property. They were in their 30s, looking to start a small farm, and they'd heard about the cooperative. "Mrs. Cooper," the young woman said, "we'd like to join the cooperative. We don't have much land or equipment, but we're willing to work hard." Judith smiled and invited them in for coffee. As they sat in her modest kitchen, she told them about her grandfather, about the journals, about the importance of learning from those who came before, about the value of patience and the danger of arrogance. "The land will teach you," she said, "if you're willing to listen, but you have to be patient. You have to be humble, and you have to understand that sometimes the things that look broken are just waiting for the right time to show their value." The young couple listened carefully, and Judith saw in their faces the same eager determination she'd had 50 years ago when she was starting out. She gave them copies of her grandfather's journals. "Study these," she said. "Learn from him. And when you build your own farm, build it to last. Build it to endure. Build it so that when the hard times come, and they will come, you'll be ready." They thanked her and left, and Judith watched them drive away, feeling hopeful about the future. That afternoon, she walked out to her well one more time. The December sun was weak and pale, but the air was crisp and clean. The drought was truly over, but its lessons remained. Judith touched the stones of the well, feeling the rough texture under her fingers. "Thank you, grandfather," she said quietly. "You were right. About all of it. The deep vein, the patience, the wisdom of waiting. Thank you for teaching me." In the distance, she could see Dale Thornton working his small remaining farm. She could see other neighbors tending their land. She could see the community that had emerged from crisis, smaller, humbler, wiser, and she smiled, because she'd learned something her grandfather had tried to teach her all along, that true wealth isn't measured in acres or technology or the envy of others. True wealth is measured in the depth of your preparation, the strength of your patience, and the generosity of your spirit when others need help. The well that everyone said was broken had never been broken at all. It had just been waiting, waiting for the right time, waiting for the moment when its true value would be revealed, waiting to teach everyone who'd mocked it that sometimes the old ways, the patient ways, the ways that require faith and persistence, are the ways that save us when everything else fails. Judith pulled up one more bucket of water, cold and pure and perfect, and poured it into her garden. The water flowed where it was meant to flow, and Judith, who'd cared for the source when no one else believed, would never die of thirst. If this story moved you, leave one word in the comments. And remember, those who mock the patient often learn their lessons when the wells run dry. The ones who tend the source, who prepare for hard times, who have the faith to work when others laugh, they're the ones who survive. They're the ones who thrive. They're the ones who prove that wisdom and patience are worth more than all the technology and arrogance in the world. Judith's story is a reminder that we're never too old to be vindicated, never too dismissed to be essential, and never too mocked to be proven right. Take care of your sources. Prepare for hard times. Have faith when others doubt. And when the drought comes, and it will come, you'll be the one with water while empires crumble to dust. 3 years after the well began flowing, Judith sat on her porch on a mild spring evening, watching the sunset paint the Oklahoma sky in shades of gold and purple. The land had recovered from the drought. Rain had returned to normal patterns. The crisis had passed, but nothing was the same. Her small farm, once dismissed as worthless, had become something remarkable. The 10 acres were lush and productive, a model of sustainable agriculture. She grew vegetables, raised chickens, tended fruit trees. She didn't try to farm on an industrial scale. She worked within the limits of what one person could manage, what the land could sustainably produce. And it was enough, more than enough. The cooperative she'd founded had grown to include 47 farms. They shared equipment, labor, knowledge, and water resources. They'd weathered the drought together and had emerged stronger for it. Young people were moving back to farming, attracted by the cooperative model, by the idea of sustainable agriculture, by the community that had formed around Judith's well. Dale Thornton's transformation had been complete. His small 50-acre farm was thriving, not with the flashy success of his old empire, but with the steady productivity of a man who'd learned to work with the land instead of trying to dominate it. He and Judith had become unlikely friends. He'd learned humility the hard way, and he never forgot the lesson. That evening, a car pulled up to Judith's house. A young woman got out, perhaps 30 years old, dressed in jeans and work boots, with a notebook under her arm. "Mrs. Cooper, I'm Emma Richardson. I'm writing a book about the drought, about the farmers who survived. I was hoping you'd let me interview you." Judith smiled and invited her in. They sat in the modest kitchen, drinking tea, and Emma asked questions about the well, about Judith's grandfather, about the years of mockery and the moment of vindication. "How did you keep going?" Emma asked. "For when everyone said you were wasting your time, when everyone laughed at you, how did you keep faith?" Judith thought about that for a long moment. "My grandfather left me more than just a well," she finally said. "He left me knowledge, and he left me the understanding that some truths aren't popular. Some truths require patience to prove, and if you know something is true, really know it, deep in your bones, then it doesn't matter what other people say. You keep working, you keep faith, you wait for the truth to reveal itself." "That's a hard way to live," Emma said. "It is," Judith agreed, "but it's an honest way, and when the moment comes, when the well finally flows, when the truth finally shows itself, that vindication is worth every moment of doubt." Emma stayed for 2 hours, filling her notebook with Judith's story. When she left, she thanked Judith and said, "Your story gives me hope, that patience and wisdom still matter, that the old ways aren't always obsolete, that we don't have to sacrifice everything for progress." Judith watched her drive away, then walked back out to her well. The evening was quiet, the air cool. She ran her hand along the stones, feeling the familiar texture, feeling the history contained in this structure her grandfather had built a century ago. The crank had been replaced now. The old one finally gave out after 90 years of service. But the new one was built to the same design, wood and iron, simple and functional. Judith lowered the bucket and listened to the splash. Even after 3 years, that sound still made her smile. She pulled up water, still cold, still pure, still flowing from the deep vein that didn't care about droughts or doubters. She poured it into her garden, watching it soak into the rich soil, sustaining the life that grew there. This was her legacy, not just the well, but the lesson it taught. That patience mattered, that wisdom endured, that the things everyone dismissed might be the things that saved you, that faith, when rooted in truth, was always vindicated eventually. Judith was 75 now. She wouldn't live forever, but the well would endure. The cooperative would continue. The lessons would be passed down, and somewhere, someday, another person would face mockery for believing in something the world said was foolish. And maybe, if they heard Judith's story, they'd have the courage to keep faith, to keep working, to wait for the moment when the truth revealed itself, and the mockers fell silent. The sky was darkening now, stars beginning to appear. Judith pulled up one more bucket of water, cold and pure and perfect, and poured it out as an offering to the land that had sustained her family for a century. "Thank you, grandfather," she said softly, "for the well, for the wisdom, for teaching me that some things are worth waiting for, even when you wait a lifetime." In the distance she could see lights coming on in Dale's farmhouse, lights in the homes of the other cooperative members, a community of people who'd learned, through crisis and suffering, and ultimately through grace, that true wealth wasn't measured in acres or technology or the envy of others. True wealth was measured in resilience, in community, in the wisdom to prepare, in the generosity to share, in the patience to wait for truth to reveal itself, and in the courage to keep faith when everyone else called you a fool. Judith walked back to her house, leaving the bucket on the rim of the well for tomorrow's work. Inside, she pulled out her grandfather's journals and added her own entry, something she'd started doing after the well began flowing, continuing his tradition of recording knowledge for future generations. "The well flowed today, as it has for 3 years now," she wrote. "The water is cold and pure. The land is green. The community is strong. I am old now and my time grows short, but I am content. I kept faith with my grandfather's wisdom. I endured the mockery. I did the work. And when the drought came, I had water while others had only dust. May whoever reads this understand. Patience is not passivity. Faith is not foolishness. And the things that seem broken may just be waiting for their moment to prove their worth. Tend your sources. Prepare for hard times. Keep faith with what is true even when the world laughs. And when your moment comes, and it will come, you'll be the one standing in the green garden while empires crumble to dust." Judith Cooper, Spring 2026. She closed the journal, turned out the light, and went to bed. And in the morning she would rise and walk to her well and pull up water and tend to her land. Because that's what you did when you'd been given a gift. You used it wisely. You shared it generously. You kept faith with the source. And you taught the next generation that sometimes the old ways, the patient ways, the ways that everyone mocked, were the ways that endured when everything else failed. The years continued to pass, and Judith's story spread far beyond Oklahoma. The book Emma Richardson wrote became a bestseller, inspiring people across the country who felt dismissed by a world that valued only speed and technology and immediate results. Judith received letters from around the world, from other elderly people who'd been told their knowledge was obsolete, from young farmers trying to learn sustainable methods, from communities trying to rebuild after their own crises. She answered every letter personally, always with the same message: be patient, have faith in what you know to be true, prepare for hard times, and when the world laughs at you, remember that vindication comes to those who can wait. When Judith finally passed away at 81, the entire county attended her funeral. The church couldn't hold everyone, so they held the service outside, near her well. Dale Thornton gave the eulogy, his voice breaking as he described how Judith had saved his life and taught him what real strength looked like. The cooperative members stood together, holding buckets of water from Judith's well, and each poured a bucket onto the ground as their final tribute. The well still flows today. The cooperative maintains it as a memorial and a reminder. They've never charged for its water. They keep it exactly as Judith kept it, open to anyone who needs it, shared freely with those who ask respectfully, a source of life in hard times. And on the stone rim of the well they placed a bronze plaque with Judith's words, "Patience is not passivity. Faith is not foolishness. What seems broken may just be waiting." Judith Cooper. Her story remains a testament to what one person can accomplish with wisdom, patience, and the courage to believe in truth, even when the whole world calls it a lie. She proved that age is not obsolescence, that old knowledge can save new crises, and that the ones we dismiss as crazy often turn out to be the ones who save us all. Today, visitors still come to see Judith's well. They come from cities and suburbs, from farms and universities, from places where water flows easily from taps, and places where every drop is precious. They stand at the ancient stone structure, and look down into its depths, and they think about patience, about faith, about the wisdom of preparing when times are good so you can endure when times are hard. The cooperative she founded has grown to over 100 farms now, a model studied by agricultural programs worldwide. They've weathered 3 more droughts since Judith passed, and each time the lessons she taught about cooperation, about respecting the land, about not overextending, about keeping sources pure, have seen them through. Young people join the cooperative every year, learning from the older members who learned from Judith, who learned from her grandfather. The chain of wisdom continues, unbroken, passed from generation to generation, rooted in the truth that some things endure while empires rise and fall. Dale Thornton lived to 93, farming his small 50 acres until the very end. Before he died, he told his grandchildren about Judith, about his own arrogance, about the day he had to beg for water from the woman he'd mocked. Remember her, he told them. Remember that real strength isn't in dominating, but in enduring, isn't in taking, but in sharing, isn't in showing off, but in preparing quietly. Judith Cooper was the strongest person I ever knew, and she saved my life by teaching me humility. Don't ever forget that lesson. And they haven't. The story lives on, in the cooperative meetings, in the journals that Judith left, now carefully preserved in the County Historical Society, in the well that still flows, cold and pure, a monument to patience rewarded and wisdom vindicated. If you ever find yourself in rural Oklahoma, look for the small sign on County Road 17 that says Cooper Wells Cooperative. Turn down that road, drive 3 miles, and you'll see it, an ancient stone well with a wooden crank, surrounded by green fields, still producing water after more than 100 years. Stop, look, listen. And maybe you'll hear what Judith heard that September morning, when the bucket finally splashed. The sound of faith vindicated, of patience rewarded, of truth that waited until its moment to reveal itself. And maybe you'll learn what everyone who knew Judith learned, that we're never too old to be proven right, that we're never too old to be proven right, never too dismissed to be essential, never too mocked to change the world. All it takes is patience, faith, and the courage to tend your source when everyone else says you're wasting your time.